Bangladesh is definitely navigating a fascinating political moment right now. And to really get a handle on it, you need to understand the key leaders involved.
Absolutely.
So for this deep dive, we're going to focus on two figures: President Mohammed Shahabuddin and the chief advisor, Dr. Mohammed Yunus.
We've looked at, news analyses, official reports, backgrounders on both, because you've probably seen these names pop up.
Yeah, exactly.
And our aim here is really to clarify who's doing what in Bangladesh's current government structure.
And I think it's really important right from the start to clear up something that might be confusing for people. Dr. Mohammed Yunus, while he's leading the interim government as chief advisor, he isn't the president.
That's crucial, yes. The president is Mohammed Shahabuddin, a totally different role.
Right. And we'll definitely dig into that distinction. We'll look at their backgrounds, how they ended up in these really crucial positions, and this kind of unique dual leadership setup that's emerged after the recent political shifts. Okay, so maybe let's start with Dr. Mohammed Yunus. I mean, he's a name people know globally, mainly for microfinance. How did he end up as chief advisor? It's quite a shift.
It really is. And what's interesting about Yunus is how a specific moment in history seems to have just completely shaped his path.
Right.
He had this solid academic background, grew up in Chittagong, got his PhD in economics from Vanderbilt in the U.S.
Okay.
But then the 1974 famine hit Bangladesh. And that appears to have been the catalyst. It shifted his focus massively from sort of abstract economic theory towards finding practical ways to help people suffering right there.
Wow. You can just imagine, right? An economist steeped in theory, suddenly face-to-face with that kind of devastating reality. And that apparently led directly to this almost symbolic first step lending, just $27 to 42 artisans.
Yeah, just $27. It sounds tiny, but it was the seed of a huge idea.
It really was, because it wasn't just charity, was it? It was about challenging the whole banking system.
Exactly. These artisans, they couldn't get loans from traditional banks. No collateral.
So they were stuck.
Pretty much stuck in a cycle of poverty. That tiny loan, it was the birth of microcredit, the idea of giving small, unsecured loans to empower the poorest people.
And then that idea just grew and grew. It became the Grameen Bank Project in '76.
Right.
And then formally established as Grameen Bank, an independent bank, in 1983. That really cemented this whole new way of thinking about finance.
And its core principles were, well, revolutionary for banking at the time. It operated on trust. Trust in the poor.
And no need for collateral.
That was a big one. It just unlocked capital for millions who were completely shut out before.
The other really striking thing is the focus on women. Over 95% of the borrowers were women. Why was that?
Well, there were a couple of key reasons, based on what they observed happening on the ground.
Okay.
First, they found that when women got the loans, the money was more likely to directly benefit the whole family. Better nutrition for kids, education, that sort of thing. And second, the repayment rates among women were consistently remarkably high, which kind of flew in the face of traditional banking wisdom.
So it was both socially impactful and financially sound in their model?
Exactly. And Yunus didn't stop there. He also developed this concept of social business.
How's that different from just, a regular company?
A social business exists primarily to solve a social problem, not to make maximum profit for shareholders.
Okay.
Any profit or surplus it generates gets reinvested back into the business itself to expand its reach or improve its services. No dividends paid out. It's about blending sustainability with a social mission.
And the impact of Grameen and microcredit, it wasn't just confined to Bangladesh, was it? It went global.
Oh, absolutely. By 2006, when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, Grameen had already loaned money to millions. And the model itself got picked up in, over 100 countries. It showed this huge unmet need for financial inclusion everywhere. Billions of dollars loaned out eventually. The scale is just immense.
That Nobel Prize in 2006, plus other major awards like the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Congressional Gold Medal, it really highlights the massive impact he had on poverty reduction.
No question.
Which makes his current role, chief advisor of the interim government, such a dramatic turn. What exactly happened in August 2024 that led to his appointment?
It followed a really turbulent time. There were huge student-led protests across the country.
Right, I remember seeing reports.
And they ultimately led to the resignation of the prime minister at the time, Sheikh Hasina. So in that kind of power vacuum, that transitional moment, the role of chief advisor becomes absolutely critical.
Okay, so for listeners who might not be super familiar with Bangladesh's system, what does the chief advisor actually do in this interim setup? What kind of power do they have?
Right. So the chief advisor essentially heads up the interim government. They hold executive power, quite similar to a prime minister in a regular government structure.
Right.
The main job is managing the country during this transition, pushing through necessary reforms, and this is key, setting things up for free and fair parliamentary elections.
And has his administration taken concrete steps since he took office?
Yes, they have. One of the early moves was setting up a constitutional reform commission,
Okay.
which signals, an intent to look at potentially deeper systemic issues in how the country is governed. And there was also talk of convening a constituent assembly to look at possible changes to the Constitution itself.
And it looks like his core beliefs about microfinance and social business are still very much part of his thinking, even in this political role.
Definitely. You see it in that May 2025 proposal for a new microcredit bank
Right.
based on the social business model owned by the recipients themselves, aimed at providing venture capital for young people starting businesses. It's pure Yunus philosophy.
Yeah.
And even his comments at that MRA building inauguration, calling microfinance the real banking system built on trust, it shows that conviction hasn't changed.
But it hasn't all been smooth sailing for him as chief advisor, has it? By May 2025, there were reports he was actually thinking about resigning.
That's right. Look, he came in with a lot of goodwill, both domestically and internationally. But navigating Bangladesh's political landscape, especially now, is incredibly tough. There are reports of political gridlock, intense pressure from different factions, and just real difficulties in getting his agenda moving. That reported, quote, "What is the point of being the chief advisor if he cannot function properly?" That really tells you something about the frustrations.
And it's not just internal politics causing problems, right? There's been criticism from outside groups, too.
Yes, several things. There's pressure over the lack of a clear election timeline. Political parties want it, the public wants it.
And the army chief reportedly set a deadline.
Reportedly, yes, December 2025. That adds another layer of pressure. Then you have things like reported tensions with the military, for instance, over rejecting that Myanmar humanitarian corridor idea. And organizations like Human Rights Watch have raised concerns, too, about things like the reported banning of the Awami League Party.
Plus, you have parties like the BNP pushing hard for an election date and apparently disagreeing about who should be on the election commission and the advisory council itself. It sounds incredibly complex.
It really does. It highlights this fundamental challenge, doesn't it? You have this global icon respected worldwide for his moral authority and groundbreaking work.
Yeah.
And then you put him into the thick of national politics with all its ingrained divisions and power struggles. It's a very different game. His reported frustration is like, if I can't work, the political parties, you've all failed to reach common ground. It just captures that difficulty, that struggle to translate his vision into effective governance in this very polarized situation.
Right. Okay, so that's the journey of Dr. Yunus. Now let's shift gears and talk about Mohammed Shahabuddin. His path to the presidency feels quite different, much more rooted in Bangladesh's established public service and political systems.
Yes, it's a real contrast in background and experience. While Yunus spent most of his career outside formal government until recently, Shahabuddin has this long history within the system, judiciary, commissions, party politics.
So let's unpack that. He was born in Pabna. His parents were Sorab Hussain and Hina Halim, and he pursued quite a bit of education.
He did. A Bachelor of Science from Edward College, then a Master's in Psychology from Rajshahi University, and also an LLB, a law degree from Shahid Aminuddin Law College.
But he wasn't just focused on academics, right? He got involved in politics quite early on.
That's right. Even as a student, he was involved in leadership roles with the student wing, the Chhatra League, and the youth wing, the Jubo League, back in Pabna.
And crucially, his involvement in the 1971 Liberation War.
Yes, that's a really significant part of his biography. He was an active freedom fighter, part of the Mujib Bahini. There are accounts of him being involved in hoisting the Bangladesh flag in Pabna right at the beginning of the war.
That level of commitment during such a critical time, but it also came at a personal cost later on.
It did. After Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was assassinated in 1975, Shahabuddin was arrested and actually imprisoned for 3 years.
Wow. That must have been a formative experience.
Undoubtedly. After his release, he continued in politics, but also built this long, solid career in the judiciary. Started as a Munsef in 1982, worked his way up,
Right.
and eventually retired as a district and sessions judge in 2006. He was also elected Secretary General of the Bangladesh Judicial Service Association, which shows respect from his peers.
And even after retiring from the bench, he didn't exactly step back from public life. He went back to practicing law.
Yes, in the High Court Division of the Supreme Court.
Mm.
And he took on some really important roles.
Such as?
Well, he served as a coordinator in the trial of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's assassins, a hugely sensitive case.
Definitely.
And he also chaired the Showdown Commission. That investigated attacks against Awami League supporters and minorities after the 2001 election. So roles focused on justice and accountability.
He also had a stint at the Anti-Corruption Commission, the ACC.
Yes, from 2011 to 2016. And during that time, he was involved in overseeing the investigation into those allegations around the Pattern Bridge project.
Ah, that was a big deal.
Huge deal. The ACC, under his watch, investigated and found no proof of corruption. And interestingly, that finding was later backed up by a Canadian court. It speaks to his focus on, trying to maintain integrity.
And throughout all this, his judicial career, these commission roles, he maintained his connection to the Awami League.
He did. He eventually became part of their advisory council, held senior party posts like chairman of the Publicity and Publications Subcommittee, even served as an election commissioner for their 2022 National Council.
We should also mention he was on the board of Islami Bank for a while, but stepped down when he was elected president.
Correct. That leads us to February 2023. The Awami League Parliamentary Party nominated him for president, and he was elected unopposed,
becoming the 22nd president of Bangladesh.
He formally took office on April 24, 2023, sworn in at the Banga Bhavan by the Speaker of the Jatiya Sangsad, the parliament.
So, as president in Bangladesh's system, which is parliamentary, what does his role actually involve? What are his powers?
Well, day to day, the president is the head of state, and it's largely a ceremonial position. The real executive power usually lies with the prime minister and the cabinet.
Usually.
But the Constitution gives the president certain reserve powers, and these can become very important during political crises or transitions.
Like the one we've been talking about.
Exactly. But even before that, we saw an example when he vetoed the Labor Bill 2023 in December of that year, so he can assert that authority.
And those reserve powers were definitely front and center in August 2024 after Prime Minister Hasina resigned.
Absolutely critical. President Shahboudin really stepped into the breach. He addressed the nation. He formally accepted the resignation, though there was some later controversy about the letter itself.
Right.
He dissolved parliament, started the talks to form the interim government, and importantly, as commander-in-chief, he ordered a reshuffle within the army and also ordered Khalida Zia's release.
Key actions. And then the really pivotal step of swearing in Dr. Mohammed Yunus as the chief advisor on August 8th.
Yes, that was his constitutional duty in that situation. He also appointed the new Chief Justice shortly after. These were the formal steps needed to set up the interim administration.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Despite his long, deep ties to the Awami League, his actions during that transition largely seemed to follow the constitutional playbook. He facilitated the handover to an interim government led by someone from outside his party's sphere.
That's a key observation, yes. His adherence to the process was vital at that moment.
Although there was that hiccup later, in October 2024, about his comments on Hasina's resignation letter. That caused a bit of a stir.
It did. It briefly led to calls for his resignation. It just shows how politically charged everything is and how carefully the president has to tread, especially during such a sensitive time. But he later clarified things, suggesting the matter was settled.
So, looking at his whole career, law, judiciary, commissions, politics, it provides this bedrock of experience within the Bangladeshi state structure for his current role as president, holding things together during this, pretty critical time.
Definitely. A long career in public service shaping his approach now.
Okay, so we have these two very different figures now leading Bangladesh. President Shahboudin, the head of state, and Dr. Yunus, the chief advisor heading the interim government. How does this actually work in practice, this dual leadership?
Right, let's try and break down that dynamic. It is quite unique.
So you have the president, Shahboudin. His role is mostly ceremonial day-to-day, you said.
Mostly, yes. Head of state functions. But, as we saw, he holds those crucial reserve powers, appointing the chief advisor, dissolving parliament, signing off on laws which really come into play during transitions like this one. His actions in August 2024 are the perfect example.
And then you have the chief advisor, Dr. Yunus. He's the one with the executive power, like a temporary prime minister.
That's a good way to think about it, yes. He heads the non-party interim government. He leads an advisory committee. And the idea is that these advisors are politically neutral figures. Their job is to run the country and prepare for elections.
And this whole idea of an interim caretaker government led by a chief advisor, this isn't the first time Bangladesh has done this, is it?
Oh, no, not at all. This system actually came into being formally back in 1996 through the 13th Amendment to the Constitution.
Why did they introduce it?
The main goal was to try and guarantee fair elections. There were often worries that the party in power couldn't be neutral when overseeing the voting process. So the caretaker government was meant to provide a neutral administration just for the election period.
I see. And Dr. Yunus is the fifth person to hold this chief advisor role.
That's right, which tells you that Bangladesh has turned to this mechanism several times over the years when facing political deadlock or transitions.
And the core job, the mandate for Dr. Yunus and his team right now is clear. Get the country to fresh elections and make necessary reforms.
That's the fundamental task. Steer towards new parliamentary elections and implement reforms, particularly to these electoral system and maybe broader governance issues.
But as we discussed earlier, actually doing that is proving, well, challenging.
Extremely challenging. Setting an election timeline everyone can agree on, ensuring the process is seen as genuinely fair by all sides, getting consensus on what reforms are needed and how to implement them. These are massive hurdles.
Yeah.
The pressures Dr. Yunus was reportedly facing by May 2025 really highlight just how difficult it is. And the work of that Constitutional Reform Commission will be really important to watch in this context.
It really underscores this recurring theme in Bangladesh's politics, doesn't it? The struggle to build lasting trust in elections and in the neutrality of state institutions.
Precisely. The very fact that they keep needing these caretaker setups, often bringing in figures seen as being above politics.
Like Dr. Yunus.
Exactly. It points to a kind of systemic vulnerability, perhaps, in the regular political process.
And the difficulties Dr. Yunus is facing now, despite his huge international standing and respect,
Right.
it shows that even having a leader like that doesn't just magically fix deep political divides or the tough demands of governing.
It really doesn't.
Yeah.
It shows that goodwill and a great track record in one field don't automatically translate into navigating complex national politics. The success or failure of this interim period is just incredibly important for Bangladesh's democratic future.
So just to wrap up our deep dive then, we've looked at President Mohammad Shahabuddin, the current head of state, coming from this long background in Bangladesh's legal and political institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And then Chief Advisor Dr. Mohammad Yunus, globally known for microfinance, now leading the interim government with this mandate for reform and elections. Crucially, they hold distinct roles.
Yes, that distinction is key, and it's undeniably a complex and absolutely critical transition period for Bangladesh. What happens next will really shape the country's path forward.
It certainly will. And as Bangladesh finds its way through this intricate political time, it really makes you think, doesn't it, about the different kinds of leadership needed during transitions. You know, can the skills that earn someone global praise always translate effectively into managing the messy realities of national politics? It's something to watch.
A very pertinent question.
Definitely keep an eye on how things develop there.